Firefox has excellent security and privacy features, and very importantly, unlike Chrome, it allows for security extensions to make low-level changes that are needed for security. Chrome limits what the extensions can do, so for example, there is no NoScript extension for Chrome. Chrome has better sandboxing than Firefox, but unfortunately Chrome is developed by Google, whose whole business model relates to tracking every single internet user. And Google, by a long way, is the biggest corporate tracker of all internet users. So for that reason, Firefox is a good choice for a browser, even though Chrome is arguably stronger in terms of security design and implementation. Let's look at the standard security and privacy features built into Firefox. So let's go to the Privacy tab, which is here, Options, Privacy. And let's start at the top. Request that sites not track you. This is the Do Not Track feature. When this is enabled, Firefox adds a DNT flag in the HTTP headers that you send to sites to ask them if they would mind not tracking you. Thank you very much. And there you go. That's essentially what it looks like. It sends that DNT flag in the HTTP headers. The websites are not obliged in any way to accept your request. This is a voluntary policy sites can follow. Some of the sites follow it, some don't. Microsoft, as an example, made a clear statement that they wouldn't be following it. Here's where DNT comes from, so you can read the policy there from the EFF. And Firefox has got its own page on Do Not Track if you want to find out more information on it. But that's the top one. Request that sites not track you. You might as well have it switched on. It does no harm. Next is the Use Tracking Protection in Private Windows option. If we go over here to change block list, we can see that this is the disconnect.me service. And disconnect.me provides to your browser a list of domains and URLs that track you. With this feature enabled, Firefox will prevent all requests to those sites that you go to directly or that are hidden inside a page that you might be on. And as you can see here, you've got the basic setting and then you've got the more strict setting. Later on, I'm going to recommend some extensions that do a better job than this on its own. But if you're not going to use those extensions, then it might be worth putting it on strict mode here and save. Let's not restart for now. Cancel. If you want to test to see whether or not the tracking is working, there's a URL here, and you can see here it's saying correctly blocked. So if this was a site that you were on and it was blocked, you could go here and you could see that it is being blocked. Firefox is blocking parts of the page. And if you want to disable that blocking, because say for example the site's not working correctly and you need it to, then you can disable it here by pressing this. If you want to learn more, then follow this link here and it'll tell you more, but essentially it's just going to say exactly the same as what I've just said now. So that's Use Tracking Protection in Private Windows. Let's talk about the history within Firefox. So here are the options here. Remember history, the top one. This will record everything you do and allow all tracking. Pretty obvious from the name. The next one, never remember history. This will prevent many of the tracking that we've discussed on the course, as it simply stops the browser from storing most things. For example, it won't store local shared objects or flash cookies. It will prevent storing cookies in RGB values of auto-generated force-cached PNGs using a HTML5 canvas tag to read pixels, i.e. cookies, back out. It will prevent storing cookies in web history, HTTP e-tags, web cache. It'll prevent Windows.name caching. It'll also prevent HTML5 session storage, local storage, global storage, database storage via SQLite, IndexedDB. So it prevents a lot of storage. But unfortunately, this will stop sites remembering some of your preferences. Like, for example, a search engine needs to know what your language preference is. It can get it from your IP address, potentially, but usually it needs something like a cookie to remember those sorts of things. Mostly, personally, I find it not a big issue just to have never remember history. It doesn't really cause me much of a problem. Once you're logged into a site, the site knows who you are anyway. So the sites I'm logged into, I want them to know who I am. The sites I'm not logged into, I don't want them to know. So never remembering history works fine for me. Obviously, never remembering history doesn't hide your IP address in any way. And the third option is use custom settings for history. So one thing you could do is you could add exceptions here for sites that you do want to allow to store cookies, like say a search engine or sites you're not particularly bothered about. So that's a useful option as well. And you don't want to accept cookies from third parties. The majority of the time that's purely just for tracking you. I'll discuss more on tracking prevention as we go through this browser section. Firefox has a private browsing feature which you can access by going to here and new private window. And there you go, you're in a private window, and you can see the mask here indicating that you're in a private window, and then you just use the browser as you would do normally. Another way to access it is to right click on links and open link in new private window. And there you can see the mask again. So what does private browsing mean? Well, what it means is that essentially never remember history is set for that window. And we can find out specifically what that means if we go to this URL here, about:private browsing, open private window, which we saw before, and you can see here it doesn't save in this window history, searches, cookies and temporary files, but it will allow you to download things and to bookmark things. Now this unfortunately doesn't protect you from all tracking methods. We do cover the other tracking methods and how to mitigate those as we go through this section. So this should be seen as the base level to prevent tracking and privacy invasion. And it also provides reasonable protection against basic local forensic examination. If you have never remember history set, then you won't see this mask here. This is only here if you are remembering history. So if you have never remember history set, you won't see the mask, and you actually won't need to use the private browsing mode because you'll be using it all the time anyway. Let's have a look at the Firefox security tab, which you can find here, options and security. First option is warn me when sites try to install add-ons. You obviously do want to have that set. You don't want add-ons just being installed by sites, so you definitely want a warning. Then we have these two here. So block reported attack sites. Attack sites are websites that try to infect your computer with malware when you visit. And block reported web forgeries. Web forgeries are websites associated with phishing attacks. Both of these services is essentially Google Safe Browsing. It's a service provided by Google. It's a list of URLs for web resources that contain either malware or phishing or something deemed negative by Google. Google Chrome and Apple Safari also use this service as well as Firefox, so it's quite ubiquitous in browsers. If you type about:networking, this will allow you to look at your browser's network connections. This might be interesting for you. Do you know what all of these things are? Have a look, see what connections you've got, see if you can identify what all of these connections are. But the reason I'm showing you this is because I just want to point out that one of those connections will be safe browsing to provide those two services there that I just showed you. Each time you visit a site, Firefox checks to see if the site is on a list of known bad sites using this Google Safe Browsing service. This is a solid security feature worth setting if you're only concerned about security. But what about this service and privacy? Well, from reading the documentation, the theory is because of the way the new Google Safe Browsing protocol works, Google shouldn't know where you're visiting, technically. The way it works is each URL on the block list is hashed using SHA-256, and then that list of hashes is downloaded by Firefox and stored for reference. If you're particularly concerned about privacy and don't want Mozilla, Google, and potentially other third parties possibly knowing the sites that you go to, then you might want to disable it. I suggest alternatives later anyway, and that would be by selecting these here. But of course, these are a benefit for security. Another thing to note about this, Safe Browsing also stores a mandatory cookie, which we know from documentation the United States National Security Agency uses to track you. And I'm sure other nation states and agencies will do the same because it proves useful as it's ubiquitous. So if this concerns you, then you want to disable this. If you're interested in how the Safe Browsing protocol works, then check out the developer's guide. If you want to test to see whether the functionality is actually working, there's a couple of links. This one, you should get this notification if it's working. And also this one, you should get this notification if it's working. And the final two options, this feature enables Firefox to remember usernames and passwords. I don't recommend using this. I recommend alternative password managers in the section on passwords. But if you are going to use it, then you definitely want to use a master password to protect those passwords. But as I say, I don't recommend using it. Use the alternatives that I recommend in the section on passwords and password managers.